Okay, hello, and welcome to episode 84 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So we've been discussing the third research product, which is theoretical and orientation. We're building off the work done on the previous two projects, particularly focusing in on issues of things like readability and the concept of the taskscape, so that we might examine uh, in the context of Mechanical Turk things like its different notions of artifice and the way that intelligence is always, in a sense, an artificial construction, well, a construct which is inherently artificial. So we've been talking about potential ways to examine not precisely case studies, but sort of conceptual threads of what we see as different kinds of rhetorical acts operating in Mechanical Turk and its ilk, what we might call sort of broader notions of AI and or human and digital coalitions. Well, it's not strictly just Amazon's Mechanical Turk, but sort of the direction that it and its ilk are pointing. So we're looking at rhetorical acts going on in those spaces or in those taskscapes. Particularly, we were talking last time about how they can be kind of coarsely grouped into some thematic acts like conflict,
Mhm.
um, uh, potentially collaboration, and potentially also deception, right? Some things that um, may, because those are three things that are sort of clear cases of rhetorical action, right? Things collaborating, so it requires cooperation facilitated by communication. Conflict, perhaps it's obverse, where we see um, on the one hand, people acting antagonistically toward AI through practices such as, poisoning data, such that its understanding and ability to reproduce certain things is impacted in a way that is, at least from a human perspective, negative. We might also fold things related to surveillance. This hasn't been sort of codified, but maybe things related to pervasive surveillance as an act of conflict, although in the other direction, right? If humans are fighting back against the machine is also, in a sense, fighting back through us or
Mhm.
against us. And then lastly, acts of deception, which are interesting, and we haven't fully teased this out, but, is deception a species of conflict? It's like it's not exactly clear if you look at it because they're not always cases of human v machine per se. They are these kind of interesting acts where seemingly an act of deception is occurring, which is always kind of interesting because, as we touched upon last time and previously, deception often invokes intent, right?
Mhm.
Is it possible for machines to deceive? And I think this is, Nathaniel, something you've worked on before,
Mhm.
this notion of intent and deception, because if we use that language, it possibly is ascribing these kind of humanist
Right.
notions of the machine has an intent that it is then surreptitiously concealing or acting in a way
Yeah.
that
What would be interesting there too is that deception is what makes it interesting. Sort of two responses to that is it also requires cooperation. So in that sense, it's not necessarily conflict based because to essentially for a deception to emerge requires some level of implicit or explicit coordination, right? Like particular tropes have to be deployed or um but what's interesting about deception is given our larger sort of I don't know insistence on the work of artifice, that gives us a way to articulate deception without needing to ascribe or ascertain intention, because what we can
Mm,
be arguing is that this particular kind of artifice lends itself to producing this kind of deception. And so it's not as if something like intent comes to not matter. It's that even that intent to deceive, the possibility to deceive, and the mechanisms of a given deception are already at play in the nature of a particular artifice.
mm.
So at least intention might matter, but it doesn't fully explain why a particular deception, how that particular deception, or whether that deception works or not. Right. In that sense, intent is not irrelevant. It just loses its explanatory power. Whereas
Yeah.
a lot of rhetorical scholarship, right, if you can't prove intent, you can't explain the deception. Whereas you actually could go a long way of explicating a deception by simply not making the sort of autonomous author the the agential horizon of the act.
Are there ways to frame deception? I mean, there are, but I mean, in are there theoretical ways or established methodological ways to frame deception that doesn't invoke intent, but maybe invokes something like acts that are in contradiction with each other? So it's like I can't know what your intent was, but I know your rhetorical act um, appeared to be going toward this direction, but then you also acted in ways that undercut that. Or do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Because it's like I can
yeah,
imagine a scenario where, let's say, my intent is to uh, bilk someone, but then all of my actions are toward helping them. It's like, well, then am
yeah,
I deceiving them, or is that purely on the basis of act? It's like, well, then that wasn't deception. You never acted in. I mean, it seems like deception needs to have something that is contrary in order for it to be deception. Like, even if I believe I'm hurting you, it reminds me of like that joke about like man commits to 40-year bit of ironically becoming, white cis male,
yes, yeah,
or
yeah,
that thing about the dive bar, right? At what point are you just a regular? You're not enjoying this dive bar ironically, you're just a patron, right? Where it's like,
right,
intent and conception is often opaque.
yeah,
So it's like, must there be contrary acts for something to be deceptive?
yeah, or contrary effects, or even right an attribution of deception from those affected by it.
Mm.
Right,
Mm.
I feel as if I was deceived.
Right.
Um, so a kind of an attribution of, I mean, in many ways, right, these are, I think, all useful because they move away from, to a certain extent, it's in the work that I was doing, right, it wasn't as if intent sort of was rendered sort of null and void. It was kind of a methodological argument that there are more interesting, fruitful ways of describing or explicating deception, in particular if one was invested in curtailing it somehow.
Mm.
Which is, right, if I want to stop deception, I need to do more than simply try to convince actors to operate always in good faith by
Yeah.
knowing their intentions and only acting in accordance with those. It's like, well, have you created an environment where particular forms of deception are incentivized,
Right.
or find yourself in, right? So for instance, right, the nightshade one. I mean, a lot of what make that deception work is the mechanism by which art is organized into databases, right? So what makes that deception, right? If you wanted to stop that deception, you wouldn't necessarily tell artists to behave. You would alter something in the ecology that would that would make that deception more or less likely.
Yeah.
Uh, which
Well,
is
and we
kind of
don't
also
even,
of interest to that project, right? There's for me, it's also, I think, if we're thinking about discussions of ethics or responsibility or accountability, for me, those are more fruitful the more broadly distributed they are, which is for deception to be pulled off, it requires more than just a bad actor. It it,
well,
it
we don't even have that one framed because that one seems like overt warfare, right? I mean, we talked about it last time
right.
as like being Luddite-ish, which I
Yeah.
think I noted. There's a recent article, these come out every now and then, and we had sort of a dispute about this last time, where it's like Luddite has become this kind of dismissive critique where it's like, well, you're just
Yeah.
foolishly
Yeah.
resisting process, where it's like, it's one of the great tricks the devil pulled, where it's like what you took was a labor movement and ridiculed, the same way that jaywalking became a crime because of the automobile industry, right?
Right.
Jaywalk comes from a pejorative for someone who's not paying attention, a jay or a dupe. And it became a crime because it's like, well, we need to make the world fit for autos. Therefore, we
Yeah.
need to attack pedestrians, right?
Yeah. And you're right. I don't think that example is necessarily one of deception, but I think broadly, I think it points to how our notion of artifice would be broadly applicable to, right, what are the conditions in which this kind of attack becomes possible, or the conditions in which this kind of deception becomes possible, right? It makes, I think, what makes our project potentially sort of theoretically coherent is that notion, the artifice, gives us purchase on a range of
Right.
rhetorical acts that we're seeing.
Yeah. Artifice understood as construction,
Yeah.
ecology. Yeah. Or
Yeah.
taskscape, right? I mean, the
Cascade is
term,
the word that we've been, yeah.
yeah. Yeah. I mean, that was a question I had about, is artifice still kind of like our focus or our God term or whatever? Is it like, is what we're still attentive to is the explication of artifice in these scenarios?
Yeah. And I think, and then, but furthermore, right, that that not shying away or a lack of embarrassment in artifice
Yeah.
provides a much richer reservoir of possible rhetorical actions.
I bring it up in part because you forward some, you forwarded some scholarship here, right?
Oh yeah.
This you just sent me about politics, and it kind of, and I've only read the abstract because it was
Yeah.
literally like 10 minutes ago, but
Uh-huh.
it kind of turns to notions of labor.
Yeah. That
Um, yeah, go ahead. You probably know this piece better.
yeah. Yeah. And so far as the highlighting is now officially dried on the conclusion. Um, but what it was, it's kind of a little bit it's following the kind of things we were potentially concerned about with the first two pieces, which is are we doing sort of our due diligence with the fields that we're describing?
Hmm.
And what I found compelling about this piece is that part of the thrust of their argument is that in conversations around ethics and AI, typically labor and work are basically not included in those conversations. That they're happening at a level of programming.
Yeah.
So right, there's a sense in which what's of interest to us is they're, in other words, if we're trying to say that our piece has relevance outside of our field, or it's, that kind of thing, that I think this piece is a nice way of potentially marking some resonance, which is that the actual sort of work environment of people engaging AI is is just simply being excluded from the conversation about artificial intelligence, because those discussions of ethics are grounded in the essential qualities of AI as opposed to the places in which it's.
Mm.
In other words, I'm reading this going like, they're kind of scratching at the same itch, which is you actually have to look at the taskscape in which, like, if you're not looking at labor conditions, you're not actually fully engaging AI, and so you can't really be engaging the ethics of it if you're not accounting for how it organizes labor, how labor's organized around it, how labor contributes to it, how it's impacted by it. So it's mostly just reading it so that if we're kind of making the argument that rhetoric provides a useful way of talking about this, we can point to these kinds of things where people within these fields, this piece and the transparency piece I mentioned last time, these are pieces written by folks that are closer to this conversation than we are, that I think are they're scratching at the same itch.
So that was kind of oh, and it'll make me ugh. Um, Speaking of systems of oppression,
Uh-huh.
academia. That was kind of, as is sort of my usual sort of question, like when I take a look at this, it's like, okay, well then what are we doing that isn't already being done in this
Yeah,
or
yeah.
being done in that? So I was looking at it, because that's what I was kind of looking at. In part, I was curious to learn more about how it's parsing up um, AI's deployment in labor because it points to these sort of, I don't know if you'd say higher order because that hierarchizes it, but like it
Yeah.
says topics such as discrimination and bias in job allocation, surveillance and control in the labor process, and quantification of work have received significant attention. And I was on board with that because I have all these
Mhm.
articles, particularly of things like, every day there's one about, AI is not allowed to fire you because of, performance or this issue of like job allocation, right? But then it splits this to yet questions about around AI and job quality and working conditions have not. So I was curious about how that needle is being threaded there in terms of these aspects of labor, which seem he's kind of like abstractions in a
Yeah.
certain way, right? Where it's like these things don't really drill into the practical quotidian encounters with AI. They're these sort
Yeah.
of like um category of thing, right? And you can understand why those would receive attention because
Yeah.
they're these very sort of meta level, to what degree is surveillance allowed? It's not like they're
Mhm.
easy, but it's like they're very much categorical, where it's like you have a fix in place for surveillance
Yeah.
and it
No,
has these ramifications, but like it doesn't look at the particulars of
your yeah, your instincts are on. They're looking at that. There's a really interesting connection early on that really jumped out at me is they're talking about they point out right that these concerns um, right the horizon of these principles take certain conditions as given. So in that sense, they're not they take the taskscape and the context as given. So they don't dive into arrangements, stuff like that. But they've got this great moment where, as a result, many participants in the debate have only been able to consider courses of action which fall within these limitations, right? So they're thinking about particular like in the limitations of thinking about this in terms of yes, it's this. The example this limited frame raises problems is Oren's Hippocratic Oath for Artificial Intelligence Practitioners. The oath, an attempt to model a framework for AI ethics analogous to the underpinning of the medical profession. Then they read it, but as this piece, and I've tracked down this middle stop piece, argues, the lack of an analogous institutional context in medicine means that the Hippocratic principle-based model of ethical regulations doesn't map well onto AI.
hmm,
And I both get the practice, but it maps onto, right, their AI is not yet considered in the same way that medicine is considered as a art, right? We may not use that language, but we understand that medicine is a scene in which medicine happens, right? We understand that medicine means more than simply what the doctor gives to the patient. We understand
liquid.
that it's an industry or it's a whatever. And AI seems to be treated as this kind of discrete object
Mm, yeah.
as opposed to an artifice. And so this oath doesn't work because it has no artifice that gives it any kind of meaning or teeth or whatever, right? It's an oath applied to a discrete object as opposed to an oath that exists within inside the taskscape of medicine.
Yeah,
And
that's
so
interesting. Yeah,
that
this is
pivot,
treating medicine like the comparable AI as literally the pill, not the practice
right,
medicine or
right,
the, I mean, you need that Hippocratic oath because it's like these are people doing things, so they need
yes,
guidance on that, right? I mean, the Hippocratic oath really is nothing about like, here's the pill.
right.
Exactly.
It's mostly about it's like medicine includes the pill, the bottle that it's in, how the cap can be opened by children or not, who gets to write prescriptions, right? Review boards, right? It's
But
that.
also, I mean, why do you have this pill? Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's
Yes.
like
Yeah, yeah.
it's the prescribing, it's the treatment of, yeah.
So that moment struck me as interesting where like, yeah, their medicine has an artifice in which this oath makes sense. And I think as we've looked at other places, right, that transparency piece, there's also an institution that can then track practices that are understood as malpractice, right? Like there's, you know, anyway, and that's but anyway, that all to say that in my recent reading of that, that's also what kind of jumped out at me is that could is what we're doing potentially a really digging into that and intensifying the importance of that distinction, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Because
that was,
this,
like in trying to triangulate what we're doing in that sort of plexus. That's why I was kind of curious about like, because if that one piece, and in its abstract at least, it ends up kind of forwarding, this notion of, um, right, let's see here. We identify a set of principles that could
yeah,
facilitate fair working conditions. So it's like, oh, okay, this is following through with like, I mean, it's, I don't know if they're ethicists or what, but it's like this is following through with here is, some heuristic that
yeah,
could guide either the interactions or investigation into them, provide a critique of relevant academic literature and its policies related to AI ethics. We identify a set of principles that could facilitate fairer working conditions with AI. It's like that's a clear, I mean, it's a big swing, but it's a clear goal. And I'm like, well, we're not doing that, right?
no,
So, I mean, if we return to the notion of the way that our field in general and our piece in specific can contribute is by drilling into these notions of artifice, then it's like, okay, well, then we can keep focus on what we're doing.
yeah,
You know what I mean? In contrast to other pieces that are, yeah, as you say, I mean, it's like they're hovering around the same thing, but we're not all doing the same. We don't all have the same goal exactly.
and to a certain extent, this might be another kind of case study. And one more piece about one more thing about it is in the conclusion of this sort of moment where they talk about they're also like they group this under like this historical perspective. Also emphasizes the need for stakeholders um, to begin to formulate rules. Ooh, there's a typo. Well, what do you get? That govern the operation of technologies before path dependencies can block off potentially emancipatory or liberatory routes for development. What jumped out for me there was the way they use path dependencies, which again also suggests that right the structure of these mechanisms, the artifice itself is going to produce certain effects and not other effects.
Hmm.
So the need for this kind of intervention is it's awareness that whatever we do here within this network will create path dependencies that will make certain outcomes more or less
Yeah.
likely. So again, for me, that's another move that's like, yeah, see, that's an artifice move, right? That's an attention to the artifice itself, above and beyond what a particular actor might want or what it right. There certain paths will be made possible by an artifice. And
Yeah.
once that gets going, right, then those become dependencies that make certain other kinds of actions difficult, right? So like you can't, it's sort of like as we see in all sorts of like particularly, you know, professional writing and where they look at these workplace ethnographies, like, you know, we try to do things that improve equity in the workplace, but we leave in place the governance structure from before and are surprised where, you know, we did some sensitivity training, but kept in place every other structure. And we're surprised to learn that webinar we didn't do the trick
Right.
because all the path dependencies point towards harassment or whatever, right?
Yeah. Different forms of inequality.
Yeah, but partially what's one of the ways that we could read this, and maybe that's what we offer is making more potentially more explicit what they're working around is moving away from this as a discrete object and treating it more as a taskscape or an artifice,
Mm,
which I think is that Hippocratic oath moment I think is getting at. It makes no sense to apply an oath to an object. It makes a lot of sense to apply an oath to an artifice.
mm. Yeah.
Because that middle stud piece they point to is based, the title of that one is Principles Alone Cannot Guarantee Ethical AI. And I think that's, you know, right. If you've got this essential, you need, you know, this idea of sort of ideal forms will be the way in which we handle AI. It's like, no, it's going to have to be something else.
So looking at the kind of case study things we've collected,
Yeah.
because I mean a lot of them hover around labor concerns.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because it's like when we talk about AI, it seems like the threat comes in the form of labor, right? I mean, no one's seemingly overly concerned about the machine appreciating culture that we should be appreciating. It's like it's not displacing us from, well, it's going to be watching the movies I want to watch. It's like what we're concerned about is it's taking our job.
Right.
To an extent. I mean, and that's what makes the surveillance ones kind of oddball, because there is this surveillance fear that isn't necessarily occupational. It's
Yeah.
um, it skews more kind of like a governmental notion of liberty and, sort of a fear about institutions and freedom.
Yeah.
But I was looking at these case studies because, like, I was wondering how much of this hovers around labor concerns. And it's quite a bit. It's not exclusive, though. I mean, like, the many eyes case is an interesting example because
Mm,
it's not directly a labor concern. It's like, I need to buy milk, you know.
right.
It's maybe a commercial thing, but not exclusively, because it could also be, can I, are these steps? Can I walk down this curb? I mean, I don't know exactly what its use cases
Yeah.
are.
I wonder too if there's, I mean, this would be a whole other project that people are probably doing, but where do certain what perspectives or positions or ideologies do certain fear emerges, right? Do people concerned about AI and surveillance what's the Venn diagram of that and people with labor concerns?
Yeah.
Like, does that map onto, political dispositions in some way?
Yeah.
Which
And you would assume the hypothesis is, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, that wasn't really a question.
I guess the question is, how does it?
Yeah,
In what ways
yeah.
does it?
How can I use your fears about AI to pigeonhole you politically so I can organize my world accordingly?
Yeah, well, okay. I mean, I don't know if that advanced what we were doing so much as, um, well, maybe it clarified. It's like what our aims are.
Yeah, I think for me it helps to yeah clarify that, and then also as with as I mentioned, some of the research we did around those first two pieces, that we're not completely out of sync with what people that are full-time AI people are potentially interested, invested in, or talking about, right? So we don't show
Mm.
up saying like, "Hey, look, we have, you know, we're taking ice to the Arctic to sell."
Yeah.
So, that joke's not funny anymore.
Was it ever?
Yeah.
No, but I get it, right? Where
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, yes, that, um, you don't want to wander into a conversation and be way behind or unaware of
Yeah.
its convolutions.
Uh-huh. I'll
Yeah,
look a
here's an
couple.
interesting question. Here's an interesting question. What role does Amazon's Mechanical Turk play in
Yeah.
this third piece?
I mean, I think insofar as it's our work there, I mean, that's where the sort of the way that they use task, I think got us thinking in terms of the task. I mean, in terms of, that it's it's part of the trajectory of thinking that's led us to this point,
Hmm.
which is in part of it's, I think it's still within the vein of what we were hoping this third piece would do, which is how does the the implicit or explicit theory of the things we were studying help us to further theorize these things.
Yeah.
So it may not be a direct connection, right? Like, well, based on what Turkers do, we could say this. But I think what we took away from those first two pieces is that the arrangement of this as always a particular taskscape, I think led us to then hear or see or feel artifice in the way that's led to the way that we're talking about it now. So I mean, I think for us, that's the possible trajectory. Um, and then I was just re-looking at the conclusion of our second piece where we do some of that transition stuff too.
Yeah.
So I still think we're working on what we said we'd be working on in the final paragraph of the second piece.
Yeah. Um, that I was looking at those elements as well, how the second is leading in to the third. Yeah, particularly, if we get those concepts of taskscape in the second one, potentially readability in the first one. And I wonder if readability, um, I wonder how or if that might manifest in this piece as, you know, is readability a different notion or a different notion than transparency? Because we see transparency come up in interesting
Ah,
ways in that scholarship, right? That, particularly that, not the labor one, but the right, why we should worry less about algorithmic transparency and more about citizen empowerment, right? The notion of there is no ultimate transparency that will give you what you want.
mm-hmm.
No final way. If we can just see the algorithm clearly, then we would know what's happening. I mean, I wonder the degree to which readability relates to that.
Yeah, particularly readability as we've come to know it through Mechanical Turks, which is not like transparency is generally understood as one way,
Hmm.
but we discovered particularly in the second piece, right, is there are multiple readabilities, and those readabilities are readabilities that work within a particular taskscape. And maybe right, that I like that notion then of readability is, whereas transparency would be like we just need to fully expose what's really going on.
Yeah.
making Trump-like hand gestures there, and it felt really bad doing that. Um, Whereas readability is always going to be in, right? Transparency isn't really relational, right? You just expose the thing in front of you. Whereas readability suggests you need to figure out how to read this thing in this particular, I don't know, I have to think through that, but all to say that I think potentially that's a really useful, because we now, readability in the first two pieces is theorized as this sort of emergent phenomenon, not a universal discrete task.
Yeah.
What we don't need is transparency, which goes back to the notion that there's some essence here to be
Yeah.
gotten to.
Exposed.
Is what we need is we need multiple ways of reading any given AI thing. So that's both what rhetoric brings, but it's what rhetoric brings from out of this engagement with Turks around the question of readability.
Yeah.
So that move from transparency to readability is
Yeah.
from
That was,
basically a sort of platonic exposing act to a complex rhetorical act of right. Because no one, I mean, I guess some people, right? If you watch the History Channel, it's you decode the Bible, but I think the average understanding of readability is about more than simply rendering a text transparent.
yeah.
It's making that text feel a certain way or read a certain way or highlighting certain aspects of it as opposed to other aspects of it, right? Readability is much more participatory with the thing.
Yeah. I mean, is it invitational?
Yeah.
You know?
Shit. I'm writing this one down. I don't normally write down what you say, but this is going right.
Well, it's being recorded. Why bother?
This is going in my notes and in my and in my dream journal.
And in my diary.
Yeah, my diary, which weirdly enough, it's dear Jeremy and all my diary entries.
I'm the voice of the father.
Father, you're my father figure.
Weird.
Yeah,
I
sorry.
think that's Paul.
Yeah, that is no. I was actually talking to another grad student today, and he was. We were talking about the new graduate teaching assistant, but he's in Paul's class, and he was trying somewhat successfully to describe Paul's ethos, and he was just flirting around like ethereal, magisterial. Right? It was all these like, I'm like, man, to have that ethos, what I would do.
Avuncular.
Yes, yeah, it was. And then I made the joke like, I still want to be like Paul when I grow up.
I do
So
occasionally think, like, what would he do in this scenario?
I do it all the time. The benefit of my current job is I can walk down the hall and just ask him, and then he'll tell me, and then I go do that.
I don't know. That would shatter it. I don't want
Yeah,
this to collide with the reality of it.
it doesn't see, but that's how Paul makes it work. It never, he still pulls it off.
I don't know though. That story you told me about the let's go with Tex-Mex styled uh breakfast sandwich. That one seemed like a rare misstep.
Well, nobody's perfect. It's the exception that proves the rule.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because
And he acknowledged it.
he immediately called himself out. Like he did an immediate act of contrition right there. He did like four Hail Marys, and it was all good. No, but anyway, all to say that, yeah. And then the case studies then become demonstrations of they're case studies twice over, right? They're case studies that are both of interest to us because they seem to be tacitly acknowledging the importance of artifice. But they're also case studies because then we can sort of perform readability. Like we don't want to look at these and render them transparent. We want to read them in particular ways each time. So they're both examples of tacit engagement with artifice, and then they become sort of um, an apparatus for us to perform this kind of readability as opposed to transparency.
taking notes in the outline.
Yeah.
I'm sure you hear the clacking. That's why I got the keyboard.
I have another person I was Zooming with who's invested in a,
Mechanical keyboard,
yeah, it's really satisfying to hear.
they are. And satisfying to use. Man, once
Yes.
you it's a real rabbit hole though. I mean, people get really into these, and it's like you have to make these decisions based on kind of like imperfect information where it's like, I don't know what my preferred travel distance is. What are we talking about here? So you just kind of have to pick one and
Yeah.
then go from
And
there.
if you struggle with that, your average person is likely to struggle more because I wouldn't have been able to make a rough guess, whereas you've probably got an Excel spreadsheet somewhere.
Yeah, it took a while, but there's now you can get a one from, I think it's from Keychron. That's like entry level cost. Um, I'd have to dig into this, but they have
Yeah.
one that is like very surprisingly reasonable, and so it's like you can take a flyer on it and then start basing your decisions on the experience you have,
Ah,
where it's like this is what I want to adjust. And there is actually an even cheaper thing. This is a standard thing you can buy, which is like a key tester. It is like, imagine sort of like the number pad on a lot of keyboards. Imagine that as like its own little entity, and it has different types of keys on it so you can test them out. That's a
ah,
standard thing that exists. I mean, people get so deeply into this that it's like, yeah, yeah, yeah. You can just get a key tester and see what's your preference.
like
But
getting
it's
paint swatches.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. But I mean, it makes sense because this is something of a tangent, but it's like, if you spend a lot of your time typing,
Yeah.
it matters, it's like it's just like any other kind of, um, labor
Yep.
item where it's like if you're a truck driver, your chair is gonna and your steering wheel distance, those things are gonna matter quite a bit. So it's like,
We're yeah. What are we if not intellectual truck drivers?
well, I certainly use a keyboard quite a bit.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And constantly taking uppers.
that's true. This episode brought to you by Keychron,
Yeah.
purveyor of fine
Yeah.
keyboard
It
products.
took 84 episodes, but we are finally doing sponsored content.
Finally got a sponsor that isn't ISIS, the terrorist group. Ba, ba, ba.
Just enough Easter eggs for one or two people.
Have I mentioned all relatedly? I feel like I'm this close to having a student, when I ask a question in class,
Yeah.
raise their hand and shape their response toward a sponsorship, right? Where it's like, your question makes me think about the options at Subway, Subway Eat Fresh. Like that's just dead
Yeah.
air that's waiting to be commercialized.
Yeah. And they get like a tuition remission because there's a
Yeah.
study on campus.
You
Yeah, they're
know,
basically student workers.
well, I mean, the influencer is already a semi-legitimate profession. It's like we just need
Yeah.
you to work in, at least 10 mentions of the new Southwest chicken sandwich every
Yeah.
day.
You're
I mean,
doing it.
that classroom time, break out into small group work.
You're doing it now. This is really clever. No, and by the way,
Just gonna pull a sandwich out from under the table here.
yeah. Oh, we're gonna end this episode. Jeremy's going off to Sammy Town. Um,
I'm off gluten for a while.
that makes sense. Not knowing any of the details, I can just say that makes sense.
It tracks.
By the way, forget students. I'm perfectly willing to do that in my like because I do slide decks. So I'm like, I'd love to have a slide deck that pops up like a YouTube ad, and except you can't skip it. And yeah,
Didn't
and
Ryan end a presentation by eating a candy bar?
uh-huh.
Didn't that happen? Like APA or PCA or something,
Yep. I do the
ACA,
whole thing as
PCA.
the whole lecture. I'm angry, but it's just because I'm hangry and need a Snickers bar.
Sworn this was something that happened where he was talking about commercial messaging and then bit into a candy bar at the end of it.
That sounds too smart for PCA.
Well, I don't know. Maybe there's another context. We'll
Yeah,
check.
no, that sounds right. But anyway, all to say, I would do that if I would do sponsored content in my lectures. I might put out a tweet saying I might actually just I don't think we have a Subway on campus and a Starbucks. I might at them saying I'm happy to do sponsored content in my next writing with style course. If you like a chiasmus, you're gonna love the cold cut trio.
I would, I mean, I would shade toward Jimmy John's. Subway is really, it's everybody's plan C at best.
Yeah, plus their spokespeople haven't done well in
It's
recent years.
true. It's true.
So
It feels like a cursed position.
yeah, maybe I'll do something local.
I think it's the Keychron C3.
Oh, that's right. We're still within an ad.
It's like $35, which for a
Yeah.
mechanical keyboard is
Yeah,
absolutely unheard of.
send me that link, or maybe can I point to the screen where someone can click this on YouTube?
I'm sure it'll come up.
Yeah, it will. Oh, that's funny. We're already doing it.
All right. Well,
Yeah. No, but I think yeah, I like the transparency to readability.
I added it in the outline. You know what we have to do. You know what we have to do, which is like start writing,
I know. I
There's
feel
this,
like I'm in the stage now where it's like, oh, there's just like three more articles I can read. I'll print those off and read them. It won't be unproductive, but it's basically like, cleaning your house when you have something important to do.
yeah. I might
Um,
be leaning on you to take point
yeah,
on this one anyway, although the intro stuff I might be able to at some point.
yeah.
Well, and there's no like super rush with this one either.
No. Um, yeah. I wanna I need to dig back into this. But I think that's yeah. But yeah, and I feel pretty good doing some of this sort of adjacent reading that I don't think we're out of step with,
Right.
at least some of the conversations in AI. Similar to I think we were, when we talked to Ben, what was Ben's last name?
Hanrahan.
Yeah, that right. Researchers that are, working more specifically on this. I feel like we're not, rogue agents who are just picking over some old chestnut that nobody cares
Yeah.
about. I feel like,
Well, and it'll help triangulate, here's the discourse we're entering into, which appears to be, unsurprisingly, a kind of like loosely cross-disciplinary
yeah,
discourse. I mean, I'm sure it's the conversation that CS wants to have, but part of the point is like, well, you don't get to own this for a
yeah,
lot
and
of
they're not.
reasons.
I mean, what's really interesting about the piece I shared today is right. They're going into ethics, but the way they engage ethics is just like, so we're going to talk about Aristotle, and then we're going to talk about Rawls. Like they do this sort of weird. They do what they do, which is they do like a lit review. So they're treating it like any other source, which I get, right? It's not a critique, but they're not doing the really deep theoretical work. They're just sort of here's what Aristotle says, here's what Rawls says, here's what Amartya Sen says, and here's when we're gonna pick that one and go with it. The same way you would write a method section, and we're gonna go with this way of this statistical resource for measuring this kind of thing.
Well, and this team appears to be, it says Social Sciences Division,
Yeah,
Oxford Internet Institute at U Oxford. So social sciences, I mean, that might be their route into ethics because you could also imagine, as it does, philosophy wants to own ethics. We all have our kind of like, we get, those are ours,
yeah,
but they aren't.
no, particularly ethics. Like nobody gets to own that. That's anyway. I'm still not quite sure what an ethicist is or does.
Well, people would say the same thing about rhetoricians,
Very true.
including rhetoricians.
Mostly rhetoricians, actually. No
Yeah,
one else thinks about us at all.
that's right.
which is how I like it.
Except our practical arms like marketing and
Uh-huh.
science. And yeah, that was something I think it was something I was uh talking with someone in the business college was like, rhetoric's not a dirty word for us. It's how we sell you stuff. I was like, oh, huh, that's true. I mean, that's
Uh-huh.
there. You're right.
With friends like these.
Hey, but
Hey
they make
guys,
money.
yeah, capitalism loves us. Gorgias had that big gold statue. Maybe we should just embrace it.
Your base pay would double.
Yeah, that's true. But probably fewer naps, I suspect.
All right. Well,
On that admission,
yeah. I mean, I guess and I also appreciate that you're finding these scholarly pieces because most of what I'm collecting is journalism. It's like
yeah.
it's news items about atrocities. It's not
Mhm.
scholarship. So
No, but those I think help, right? Because that's again, I think as rhetoricians, it's I think it makes sense that those end up being right for us, right? It was backing track a little bit. This is a for us, right? Every text is a possible, like we don't rank texts in terms of it's a we have this interesting struggle because our big assignment in first year writing is students have to do a dissologoi where
mm,
they inhabit different sides of an argument.
sure.
And one of the questions that new instructors have is they have questions about because we also are responsible for teaching them how to do research and like what's a credible source.
Yeah.
And so I will tell instructors like, what credible means in the context of a dissologoi is open because credibility is itself like I don't want to I don't basically I can't take a side. But if I say I'm only going to cite things that are in academic journals, you've picked sides.
Yeah.
So it might be that a student has some of their sources are .edu, and then some of them are just Reddit threads because those Reddit threads are people from that position articulating their views. Anyway, long story short, right? That I think for us, any place where this is being discussed is grist for the mill.
Yeah.
The fact that we can find these conversations in multiple locations about multiple things, I just think helps bolster our argument.
Yeah.
Because it may be that some of the people that are doing the biggest work on this are, yeah, and I'm not going to write a journal article about this. I'm going to go into these databases and mess with them. That's my taskscape.
It's also not out of it's in line with the previous pieces, right? I mean, like we made a lot of hay out of things like, Mechanical Turk made me relive my worst memory for
Yeah,
50 cents,
yeah,
because that's where a lot of this discourse was unfolding.
yeah. Alongside some of those ethnographic pieces that we read. So I think across all three pieces, I think we'll have a balance of not just perspectives, but positions and discourses that people are in.
Yeah. All right. Well, the next step is
That's
writing, is putting some, I mean, we've got an outline. It's just,
yeah.
it's cranking out pages.
Yeah. Um, yeah, let's do that. That sounds good. I'll figure out what how to do that again.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing is I'm probably going to be getting revision stuff in a couple of
Oh, yeah,
months,
that's right. Well, that's good. So I'll yeah,
maybe.
and I mean yeah, the best case scenario is we have more of this shit to do.
Well, yeah. I mean, you never get off. It's like, you never like feel like it's finished because it's just the next step in the
Yep.
process. All
All
right,
right.
then.
Well, good stuff.
Yeah.
All
All
right.
right. I will talk to you in a fortnight.
All right. Bye.
Yeah.